Welcome to our free online permaculture class. Sustainable Kashi hosts these classes every week as a way for us to each connect to each other using a foundation of permaculture. If you have any ideas for classes you'd like to see in the future or people you'd like to see present, just go ahead and type them in the chat box and we'll reach out to them and try and make it happen. Sustainable Kashi is located in Sebastian, Florida. We have an 80-acre retreat center located on the St. Sebastian River. So we're kind of surrounded by water and we're not too far from the Atlantic Ocean, which makes this a wonderful day for us to be themed around the waters. Here we have 9 demonstration gardens, volunteer opportunities, an off-grid eco-village, so many classes and workshops. Make sure to go to sustainablekashi.com to learn more about us. Today, we are talking to Michael Richardson. Michael Richardson lives in Australia. It's actually 1 o'clock in the morning for him out there, 1 o'clock tomorrow morning, so he's in the future. And he has worked with the Barrier Reef Parks, the Shark Conservation Authority, Project Aware. He's had lots and lots of experience working and connecting to our oceans. And today he's going to share a little bit of his story and his work and how our relationship with the oceans are so important to all of us. So Michael, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Terry. Honestly, yeah, it's an absolute pleasure, man. And, you know, one in the morning or not, like, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here and have this opportunity to share. So thank you. Okay, so this is the really cool display picture that Amy, I'm assuming, put together. So thank you, Amy, absolute rock star. So let's get started. So a bit of an introduction. So for starters, I'd like to give a little bit of context for what's going on here, a bit of some of the stuff we're going to be talking about and why. So I was sitting in a hotel room in quarantine, having come back from a bit of travel, having gone through Sydney Airport, which is a considered COVID hotspot. And I'm sitting there bored in my hotel room and I think to myself, well, you know what, I could actually use this as an opportunity. I've wanted to do my PDC for so long. And I just was trawling through Facebook and I saw Amy just doing the wonderful things she does and holding some vegetables in her hands and looking just so chuffed with herself and so happy. And I just thought, you know what, this is it, like, it's time. So I sent her a message saying, yeah, I've committed, I'm doing this PDC finally. And she said, hey, what are you doing on October the 22nd? And I said, oh, got no plans. Why? What do you mean? She said, oh, you should come talk to us about, like, permaculture. I was like, you know, I just said I only just started my PDC, right? She's like, oh, but you know all about the ocean. I was like, oh, now, okay, this is much more in my wheelhouse. Alrighty, sweet. So, yeah, Terry, you touched on quite a few of the things that I've done. And my background has, like yourself, I've just been in and amongst the ocean my entire life, really. It's what I absolutely just love. It's what I'm thinking about day to day. The ocean is my happy place. As you say, it's my teacher. It's everything. So, yeah, my background, you know, I've long considered going and doing marine biology degree, but I found it more worthwhile for myself, just knowing myself, to just go and do it. So I spent a long time in scuba diving, which then bridged over to conservation. And I've been a part of the conservation movement, specifically around shark conservation for a long, long time. This beautiful picture we have here, I don't know if you can see me waving my mouse right now. This is Emma, a 15-foot beautiful tiger shark who lives off the coast of Florida. She spends a lot of time hanging out in the Bahamas at Tiger Beach. So this is one of the beautiful interactions we have here. You can see just super gentle, amazing. So to frame the intention here, look, this is not going to be, we're not going to be getting too super sciencey or anything. You know, when I was chatting to Amy about, like, okay, what do you kind of want from this conversation? She was like, oh, I don't even know where to begin. So we're kind of going to have a little bit of an introductory talk through. And then we'll start bridging into some other stuff that's maybe a bit more advanced, maybe a bit more, start talking about marine permaculture, which is such a new and emerging field. There's a lot to unpack there. And then from there, we can get as crazy and nerd out as we want on that. So I'm stoked. So before we really kick into it, what I'd love to hear from you guys is, it's so crazy, I think, that we've had this opportunity. Here I am sitting in Noosa in Australia, and you guys are obviously based in Florida. Can anyone tell me, what do Noosa and Florida have in common? What make these two places in particular so special that nowhere else in the world has? Can anyone tell me that?
Loggerhead turtles?
It's not the loggerhead turtles, no. They are pretty amazing though. Okay, no one's jumping in, so I'm going to answer this one. It is that Noosa and Florida are the only two places on Earth with officially certified, I guess, Everglade systems. The only two places on Earth, which is staggering. And I think it's so amazing that, you know, we're having this conversation talking about our connection to the ocean being in these two places with such an intricate relationship to the ocean. Pretty amazing. I can't speak obviously for the Florida Everglades, but here in Australia, the Everglades account for 40% of our bird species, which is pretty amazing. And there's obviously all sorts of other wild stuff going on there. So anyway, let's rock and roll. Let's keep going. So I want to start with this beautiful quote by Sylvia Earle. If you don't know Sylvia Earle, she is an absolute pioneer in ocean science, just an absolute, she's amazing. She has been one of the most badass women in science for 80 plus years. She's just been an absolute pioneer and an absolute badass. So she says, with every drop of water you drink, every breath you take, you're connected to the sea, no matter where you live. Most of the oxygen in the atmosphere is generated by the ocean. Pretty amazing. So that kind of frames what we're going to be talking about here. So topic overview, yeah, okay, you can see all that fun stuff on the side. And we don't need to dive into that because we're about to jump into all of it in intricate detail. But my favorite thing here is this beautiful quote by Rumi, which is, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." And what I'd like to do, if anyone wants to stick their hand up, maybe, if anyone wants to take a stab at unpacking that, what does that maybe mean to them? Or we can just jump straight through it, but I could just nerd out about this one.
I have a personal attachment to this through my work with Yogananda, and he has a similar quote to where you are just a wave within the ocean. And the idea of being that same water molecule moving through all of us is that interconnectedness, which I think is so powerful in the permaculture lens, because we are so connected to absolutely every other part of the earth. So that means so much to me, and thank you.
Absolutely beautiful. Olivia and Dennis, I see you waving your hands, but Olivia's apparently clicked a button I didn't realize existed. It is a raised hand button. So go ahead, Olivia.
Yeah, too many hours on Zoom. The little blue hand. Yeah, for me, that's a pretty big conversation. Like, I feel like the universe is within. Like we are all made of everything. And I mean, I love, there's so many different ways to say it, but that settling down within oneself always gives you that opportunity to explore exactly that we're one with everything, and everything is within, and we're unstoppable.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
And Dennis?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Terry stole my thunder. I was going to go with the individual tides on the ocean, but
Terry.
as a former Navy guy, it was incredible to go out to sea and just to see where everybody else had been, where life had come from. I think most evolutionary biologists would say that the life began in the sea. Certainly none of us were around back then, and there aren't any written records, but I think that is probably an agreed upon axiom. And that being the case, coupled with my experience in the Navy, the ocean is still just quite fascinating to me, and there's so much more we need to do besides dump our trash after we get 12 miles out, if you know what I mean.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right. Well, let's rock and roll. So that's our topic overview done, and let's kick into it. So firstly, I just want to give a sort of a brief run through of kind of what we're talking about, make sure everyone's kind of on the same page. We should all have a pretty basic understanding of the water cycle, being permaculturists, but you can see obviously it does all these wonderful things, stores solar radiation, distributes heat and moisture around the globe, drives weather systems, all that fun stuff. Where it really gets interesting for me is with ocean currents acting like conveyor belts. So they circle obviously warm and cold water to and from the poles. And when you think about it, that the flowing of these resources is what makes this planet so habitable. So without the ocean currents, we'd have much greater extremes. Basically on the equator, it would just be unbearably hot and just scorch everything to cinders. And by the poles, you'd obviously just have ice caps and it'd be just pretty much a nightmare and just a generally worse place to live, I think. So here we have one of my absolute favorite quotes by Dr. Charlie Veron, the godfather of coral. If you're not familiar with Dr. Charlie Veron, he and his team have personally documented about a quarter of the world's known corals, which is just an astonishing accomplishment for any human being. But he says that humans tend to think about climate change as a terrestrial problem, but primarily it is not. What the oceans do, the terrestrial world will follow, which I think is a deep insight there. Then touching very quickly on the cultural and spiritual. So every culture and religion has praised and worshipped water as a source and sustainer of life. The ancient Egyptians obviously had the Nile River, which is the foundation of their entire culture. The Chinese had the Yangtze River, for example, all the way up to modern day religions and indigenous cultures like the Australian indigenous people. They have the rainbow serpent, which they credited with the creation of the rivers and all these wonderful things. Look, we won't dive too much into this. Everyone kind of gets the picture here, but it's also, you know, feared for its power to destroy. And, you know, all these goddesses and gods have, you know, attached to fertility have usually had some connection to water. So I think it's really, really important to understand these things. And also one thing I'd love to touch on quickly is it's only recently I've found that we've lost maybe that connection a little bit, where we can just turn on a tap and all of a sudden water is just there. If we speak to the youth nowadays, they just don't have that same connection. They don't get it in quite the same way, which is why I think something like scuba diving or free diving is so valuable, or Dennis spending, you know, all that time out on the ocean, literally, it just will fundamentally change the way you view this world of ours. So touching quickly again on economic, look, you know, the powers that be, they love to, you know, they only see value in one way, it seems, and that is through money. But so I think here's a couple of key facts which are pretty astonishing, that 2/3 of the global economy is derived from activities involving water in some form. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, it strikes me that we could not possibly put a value on the ocean, but here we are trying to, and just coming up well short. You can see here, even in this graphic here, it says it's likely to be much higher. Anyway, but so we're touching just quickly on that, and we're breezing on through, and here's where it gets to the fun stuff in my mind, which is, Dennis, you touched on the fact that life began in the oceans. And so this is my little rough guide through evolutionary history. If you can see, I don't know if these screens of ours are getting in the way, but this meme I think is hilarious. If you get that reference, it's one of my favorite little things there. But so, rough guide through evolutionary history. So let me paint the picture for you. About 3.5 billion years ago, life began on Earth, but it really took another 3 billion years for life to really take off, which is just an astonishing period of time for it to begin to really take off, which I think is amazing. So you have what's called the Cambrian period, also known as the Cambrian Explosion, about 500 million years ago. And so what happened there is plants really took off, and all of a sudden plants utilizing sunlight and carbon and oxygen as fuel, catalyzing the whole ecosystem for everything else. All of a sudden life, you know, Earth just became a much better place for living organisms. And so this is where we start to see multicellular animal species taking off. This is where we start to see diversity explode. And this is where coral reefs started to come into play. And these are essentially underwater cities, which just shaped everything, basically. And then we've got our Ordovician period here, where sharks evolved and became catalysts for evolutionary history ever since. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that throughout this. little talk here. But yeah, just quickly, Silurian period, plants first took root in soil. So I think it's really interesting to consider that these things all started in the ocean as well, even our plants. Grasses didn't exist. For example, when sharks first evolved, they've been around longer than trees. Trees and grass were not even a thing, which is just astonishing to even contemplate, if you ask me. Amphibians emerged from the ocean around 419 million years ago. The dinosaurs in the Mesozoic period, 252 million years ago. You know, and fun fact here that I pulled up actually doing some research on this one is that human fetuses still have gill slit structures during early phase development. Did not know. Pretty interesting. And I think that's just an amazing throwback to our evolutionary history. And just even now, all these literally hundreds of millions of years later, here is that amazing throwback straight to the ocean. So, you know, as Sylvia Earle says, we are as connected as humanly possible. And so we're going to dive a little bit more into some of these key periods, the Cambrian and the Ordovician. So the Cambrian Explosion, again, 500 plus million years ago. So this is where the oceans, we believe, really became oxygenated. And so this was such a catalyst, such a big thing. So with significant reduction in oxygen depleting bacteria, this is thought to have been the trigger for the rise in biodiversity. So we cannot stress enough how amazing this is. Again, if you can see these little graphics on the side, this is what the Earth was looking like right now. All of these continents just hanging together in the supercontinent of Gondwana. And then over here, you can see like the weird and wonderful life forms that were sort of existing back then, which I think is just a wild thing to contemplate. So given that coral reefs are starting to develop, they're providing ideal conditions for life. We've got plants catalyzing the food chain. We've got, you know, all of these wonderful things starting to take place. This is where, again, multicellular animal species took off and coral reefs became the cities of the ocean, providing food, safety, everything that a beautiful animal could want to live their best life underwater, essentially. And let's move on to the Ordovician period here. So life can remain confined to the sea, and the new animals evolved to replace those that didn't survive the Cambrian extinction, basically coming into play to exploit those resources that all of a sudden were left available. And obviously you can see over here such a vast ocean, you know, such a rich variety of marine life flourished in these oceans. And this is where 450 million years ago, approximately, sharks first started to evolve, and they've been shaping divergent evolution ever since. And one of my favorite examples of this is actually manatees, which I know you have over in Florida. They have common ancestry. Actually, the most closely related animal to a manatee on this planet right now is actually an elephant, which is pretty staggering, I think, because you can see exactly they have that common ancestry and they've just diverged like that. But even now, they're still so connected, which I think is absolutely beautiful. And we've got this meme here that a friend of mine tagged me in just very recently that says, sharks don't know that camels exist, which I think is hilarious. But one thing that strikes me about that, and I said to this friend of mine, I said, well, that's true, but given that sharks have been the apex predators since approximately 450 million years ago, shaping evolution, it's very likely that indirectly, sharks are actually partially responsible for the evolutionary existence of camels in the first place, which is pretty wild. So let's move on. So trophic cascades is a fundamental concept that I think we all need to understand in order to get a big picture of what we're talking about. So for those who don't know, actually most of us have probably seen that amazing video that everyone loves about how wolves change rivers. And this is exactly what we're talking about. Basically how from one end of the food chain, you know, if one thing changes in a big way, it ripples throughout the rest of the ecosystem. So an ecological effect spanning from one end of the food chain to the other. So key examples, and I wanted to address things from both the low end of the trophic scale all the way to the top. So at the low end of the primary production scale, we have things like phytoplankton and corals. And then at the top end there, we have sharks and whales. So these are some of my absolute favorite characters. And we're going to learn a bit more about them in a moment. But over here, we have, I think, probably just a beautiful summary of what's going on with this graphic here. Here we have probably the grandmasters of trophic disruption being the humans. What's going to happen if we come along and we take out all of these primary consumers? These fish here, sorry, the primary predators. If we take out these big fish here, suddenly there's going to be a whole lot of buildup of these krill here. If there's a whole lot of buildup of these krill here, what's going to happen to the phytoplankton numbers? Phytoplankton levels have dropped 40% since 1950. Fun stuff. So let's talk about phytoplankton. What's going on there? So over here, you can see the weird and wonderful forms that phytoplankton takes. So phytoplankton is this amazing substance. It is diverse forms of microscopic photosynthetic marine algae. They come in all sorts of weird, wacky varieties. They're absolutely amazing. And so you might think something so small, like what's going on there. But here you can see this is a satellite image off the coast of New Zealand. And you can start to get an idea for the scale of what we're talking about. These big weird ripples is phytoplankton in action. So you can see how these vast swarms of phytoplankton start to do some pretty amazing things, again, distributed by the amazing system that is the ocean. So what's the deal with phytoplankton? What do they do? Why do we care? Well, phytoplankton creates up to 80 to even potentially 90% by some estimates of the oxygen we breathe, which is pretty astonishing. Let's think about that for a minute. So if we stop here and hold and take a breath, this is the world without phytoplankton. So I cannot stress enough how much we need this phytoplankton, and we should all just be loving phytoplankton. It's just the best thing ever. So they form the basis of marine ecosystems, supporting everything from microscopic zooplankton. Zooplankton are the larval forms of all sorts of things from octopus and so on and so forth. Some organisms spend their entire life as zooplankton, but there are all sorts of organisms basically out there eating the phytoplankton, all the way up to whale sharks and even humans. Phytoplankton is also the catalyst for the largest migration on Earth every single night as these organisms rise up from the depths to feast on phytoplankton. Pretty astonishing stuff. Now, what I love about phytoplankton is that it's such a double-edged sword. And I think it speaks really well to the concept of permaculture in that it needs to have a balance. Because on the one hand, it can be the absolute most amazing substance on Earth that literally provides ideal conditions for life, or it can be this destructive force. So what do I mean here? So left unbalanced, phytoplankton buildup can create red tides. And you might have heard about red tides and go, oh, what's that about? Red tides are phytoplanktons essentially releasing powerful biotoxins which kill marine life and even humans who eat contaminated seafood, which is some wild, wild stuff. It's highly destructive to species like manatees, which are obviously super important to seagrass ecosystems and so on. So it's pretty wild. And in the aftermath of these red tides, we have our dead phytoplankton sinking to the bottom of the ocean, consuming the oxygen, suffocating animal life, and leaving behind a hypoxic dead zone. So no oxygen to be found, no life to be found. So you can really see, again, like this double-edged sword, like this phytoplankton starting to sound pretty serious, yeah? So let's unpack that a little bit more. And you can see over here, again, we're getting a bit of a big picture scale of what we're talking about here. You can see in this graph or this map or whatever you want to call it, this picture over here, that the whiter it gets, that's our levels of chlorophyll concentration, which are created by the phytoplankton. You can start to see spread out across the world. It's a pretty big deal. Pretty big deal. So phytoplanktons are responsible for the majority of our transfer of CO2 from the atmosphere to the ocean, about 10 gigatons of carbon each year. And you can see over here, like that's a whole lot of zeros. That's a whole lot of tons. That's some significant impact happening from something so small, which is just astonishing. So phytoplankton being so vital to marine ecology, these little imbalances can really just make all the difference in the world. So this is throwing straight back to global surface temperatures, ocean deoxygenation, acidification. It's a really, really big deal, this phytoplankton stuff. So, and here's another of my favorite quotes, a guy called Tom Zimmerman, who's an amazing inventor, invented a 3D microscope so we can start to explore the worlds of things like phytoplankton. He says, in the game of plankton, you win or you die, which is, I think, a beautiful reference to Game of Thrones, if anyone missed that one, but I just love it. So, okay, so phytoplanktons, cool. All right, what else have we got? Coral reefs here. And I want to unpack this one a little bit more and actually get a little bit of interactions, because I find even here in Australia with the barrier reef right on our doorstep, most people don't even really know what coral even is. So if anyone wants to raise their hands, again, with that little button that I don't know how you even find that, but raise your hand maybe and share, like, what is coral? What is any of that stuff? What does it do?
So coral are cnidarians, which is a kind of marine invertebrate, and they're actually related to jellyfish. So, but they just live in little communities with and excrete calcium carbonate to make the geologic structure, and they have little photosynthetic dinoflagellates in their stomachs, which help them photosynthesize. Well, actually do the photosynthesis for them so they can get some nutrients.
Yep, absolutely right. Awesome. Thank you, Marie. So yeah, beautiful summary right there. But I think painting the picture is really amazing. So when people start to look at it, they come out for a dive on the reef, for example. So again, my history is as a diver, a dive instructor, a dive leader, as a tour guide along the barrier reef, for example. And most people are just like, oh, it's just a bunch of rocks, right? But no, it's not. These things are beautiful animals, in fact. And coral reefs are comprised of millions of these beautiful animals called polyps. And so painting a picture of what that kind of looks like, they have coral blooms every year, and they're hermaphroditic. They will release vast swaths of this coral spawn, essentially, which is, again, a trophic cascade in and of itself, as everything comes to feast on that coral spawn. And from that will be born what's called a planula. And a planula is a little organism about the size of a grain of rice, which will squiggle on down to the bottom of the ocean, find maybe a nice patch of rock, and start to make its home. And from that, it will extract the calcium carbonate out of the ocean and start to create an exoskeleton. And so what you'll see is that these reef systems are essentially the exoskeletons of millions of little polyps creating their own little homes. And over time, you start to create the largest living structures on Earth. The Great Barrier Reef is approximately 2,400 kilometers or 1,500 miles, which is pretty amazing. The other thing going on with corals is, I mean, where do you start? There's so much going on because they're that awesome. But one thing that people often don't realize is that, one, they are not only structure, but they're living animal, but they're also part plant. They have this amazing symbiosis where they do internalize photosynthetic algae, which Marie beautifully summed up for us. But to paint that picture a little bit more, what we have going on is that, and this is part of where coral bleaching comes into effect, basically. So what's happening is, with the rising temperatures, you can see that the ocean acidification has become a thing with the lack of phytoplankton out there and all the CO2 we're pumping into the ocean. And what's happening there is it's making life really tough for corals, because with that increase in ocean temperatures and acidification and whatnot, it's essentially altering the compound that would have been created by that photosynthesis. And so instead it's kind of reacting kind of like poison, essentially, and living beings will do what they do when they're poisoned, which is try and expel that substance. So the very thing that they need to survive, they're expelling to try and get rid of this sickness, so-called, which is pretty wild stuff. So when you see bleached coral, like white coral, it might be a naturally white species of coral. They do exist, but a lot of it you'll see right now is bleached. That doesn't mean it's dead, it just means it is dying. So it is losing its capacity to photosynthesize. So, however, it does have the ability to reabsorb algae into its system, which is part of the amazing science that's happening right now with how to protect coral reef systems. So scientists are breeding heat-resistant strands of algae, such that if the algae doesn't create that wacky, poisonous toxicity, whatever, all of a sudden corals breathe and beat easier. That means they're not having to bleach. There's also all sorts of other stuff going on, but given just time constraints, I think we'll move on a little bit, and we can nerd out a little bit more about coral a bit later. And I will talk about this for hours because it's one of my favorite topics. But and over here we've got this beautiful picture. What people don't realize is that corals are actually active predators as well at night. So night is where really coral comes into its own. And if you go down there with like with a light, you're going to start to see all sorts of fluorescence. And this fluorescence does all sorts of wonderful things. It can act like a sunscreen if they're right up on top of the surface, blocking out some of the harmful rays, which is awesome. But also if they're a deeper species of coral, they can be acting like solar panels, which is unreal, as well as attracting prey, as doing all sorts of things. So these little polyps will poke up at night and wave around like a little jellyfish hunting for zooplankton, which is amazing. If you can get a chance to observe this, I highly recommend it. It's absolutely beautiful. So over here, again, we'll just dive back into the hardcore facts here. The coral reefs cover less than 1% of the sea floor, but are home to 25% of ocean species, which is just a staggering level of impact that they're having out there, especially when you consider that the ocean is home to 80% of all life on this planet even now. 25% on less than 1% of the seafloor. Pretty hardcore. Now we have sharks, my absolute favorites. And anyone who has spent more than 5 minutes talking to me knows I will just nerd out about this stuff for days on end. Don't get me started on sharks. But hardcore facts here. They are found in virtually all the world's oceans and have adapted to basically every kind of extreme there is, from temperatures to volcanic activity, depths, you name it. One of my favorite examples of this is the Greenland shark, which lives in Arctic temperatures. And it has adapted to these extreme colds by slowing down its metabolism, which in turn has allowed them to live for over 500 years. So there are sharks out there that are older than the very existence of the countries that we're living in right now. So, I mean, just try and wrap your head around that one. It's pretty amazing stuff. Sharks have been found in, volcanic seas. They've just adapted to everything. They are the apex predators influencing behaviors and populations of prey species. They maintain the health of entire ecosystems. So by preventing one species from monopolizing limited resources, sharks help promote biodiversity in ocean ecosystems. And we're going to jump right along because otherwise I'll be here for days and I'll just get on a roll. I just love sharks so damn much. They're just amazing animals that get such a horrible reputation that they absolutely don't deserve. To paint a small picture of that, I know that's my favorite phrase of the day, apparently, painting a picture. But there's about 500 species of sharks and only 3 of them are dangerous to humans, really. Sharks are just amazing. So let's move on. Here we have whales. So whales, you can see over here, this beautiful picture. It says when it comes to saving the planet, one whale is worth thousands of trees. So how does that work? Well, whales influence marine ecosystems in at least 4 key ways that we know of. So they play the predator role on fish and invertebrates. They also prey to predators such as orca. And here's where it gets really crazy. And this is the really fun stuff that a lot of people maybe don't know. So even in their death, whales are playing such a pivotal role to the ecosystem that is just, it's out of sight, out of mind. People don't realize this stuff, but it's called whale fall. So on the ocean floor, these carcasses create super complex localized ecosystems, and they supply sustenance to deep sea organisms for literally decades. And there's beautiful footage you can watch of this process taking place, and they call it, time lapse it, where you can see, okay, so these are some of the predators that are coming in and feasting here, right down to the microorganisms until literally the very bones crumble into dust. And all of these things, all of that nutrients is just distributed back. And given the depths that we're talking about here, these could be some of the most sustenance that these creatures see for decades potentially in turn. So we cannot stress enough, and truthfully, we don't even really understand the full impacts of what's happening there. What we do know is that they are just absolute, where do you even start? It's just the absolute foundation of deep sea ecosystems in many ways. And one of my absolute favorites here is that they are what we call vectors of nutrient transfer. So this is what we call whale pump. And I was going to say paint the picture again, but we're getting tired of that phrase. Basically what's happening there is whales just doing what they do, just traveling around, being whales, living their best lives. They're traveling up and down, doing all sorts of fun stuff, just having a whale of a time, you might say, and just traveling up and down. And in doing so, they're also transporting with them microorganisms as well as all sorts of nutrients. And as they go down, they'll do whatever they do down at the depths. A lot of science still needs to be done on this very topic. Was it Marie wants to be a marine biologist? Maybe you could check that one out. That seems pretty cool. Cool field if you need a major or a field to go into. Cool one. And in doing so, so they come back up from the depths, and this is where they do their whale business. So they've dragged up all these nutrients from the bottom of the ocean, and then they'll do their whale business. And so they'll unleash these vast storm clouds of whale poop, which contains just like absolutely super nutrient dense, just all sorts of beautiful stuff, which again is then distributed by these amazing ocean currents, which just swish it and swirl it and send it out to the far corners of the planet, basically. And in doing so, they're called ecosystem, what do they call it? Ecosystem architects, basically, because in doing so, they're just creating the ideal conditions for things like seagrasses. And the net effect of that is essentially that they're helping to sequester massive volumes of carbon, which is how we get to saying that saving one whale is worth thousands of trees. And they actually proliferate more of that phytoplankton, even though they're feasting on it. And it seems counterintuitive. You'd think more whales would mean less phytoplankton. They're actually so essential in creating that phytoplankton in the first place. So it's a whole balanced sort of approach there, which is pretty awesome. So these are some of the examples of trophic cascades that exist within nature. These are some of my favorite characters. What do we got from here? So I want to touch just briefly on the challenges going on in the ocean. And I don't want to talk too much about this because I think we all kind of get the idea. I also don't want this to be a super negative talk. But let's just touch on it briefly so we kind of know what we're talking about here, because a lot of people have maybe never even thought about this. So the big challenges facing the ocean, number one is we have overfishing. And I know I'm talking really fast, by the way, but there's just a whole bunch of stuff we kind of need to get through. And I'm just like, just such a nerd about this stuff. When I started putting it all into place, I was just going, wow, like, okay, we need to cover some stuff. But so overfishing, simply the systematic destruction of every trophic level, which is pretty scary. And yeah, when we're talking about the scale of fishing that exists out there, it's mind-blowing, basically. And here's one that people have maybe never thought of, is the bycatch that's occurring. And so basically what's happening is, as all of this demand that exists for seafood right now, essentially these organisms just don't have the capacity to regenerate that fast. And in doing so, okay, so we're now delving a bit deeper to get our seafood, okay, but these animals really don't have the ability to regenerate that fast. So we'll go a bit deeper, and so on and so on and so on. And so we've actually seen about a 50% net reduction in the actual size of the seafood we're getting now, compared to a couple of decades ago, basically, which is a really scary metric to track. And bycatch, what is bycatch? It's unintended stuff that we've caught that wasn't in our intended target species that we caught anyway. So bycatch, about 40 billion pounds a year worth of bycatch. So not our target species that we're just throwing away. And to put that into some kind of perspective, because 40 billion is a pretty hard number to sort of wrap our heads around, I want to do an exercise with you guys, which is to say, if we stopped right now and we thought of 1 million seconds, how long do you think that would take? And people sort of go up and down and like, oh, like a week. 1 million seconds is about 12 days. So how long would 1 billion seconds be? Would it be a month? Would it be 6 months? Would it be a year? It's actually closer to 32 years. 1 billion seconds is about 32 years. So that's the difference between 1 million and 1 billion. So now if we think about the 40 billion pounds a year worth of bycatch, whoa, that starts to add up. That's starting to get pretty scary. So then we've got our coastal pollution. So we can all picture massive oil spills that occurred in the past, and it's pretty dark, pretty horrible picture. But actually every day our oceans are receiving worse pollution than that from the passage of chemicals that we use on land, so largely in part due to agriculture. But here's our opportunity as permaculturists to make an impact, right? Because every tree that exists on our shores helps prevent these chemicals from traveling into the ocean. So here, and again, being as we are, here I am in Australia, there you are in Florida, being in these beautiful Everglades systems, we have such a tremendous opportunity to help make that impact and help educate people on why this is so important. And then this in turn leads to deoxygenation and dead zones, which we kind of covered earlier. And we have our habitat destruction. So again, ocean acidification is tearing apart reefs. We've got clearing of mangrove forests, particularly in places like here in Australia and in Florida, I would imagine, because people come along and we see, oh, that's a nice place to put a condo. We could make some good money out of that. Not realizing, oh, you know, like, so half of our tourism, half of our industries, 2/3 of our industries are based on the ocean, and we haven't realized quite that we're shooting ourselves in the foot by tearing this system down. It's a whole thing. Often for shrimp production, we're tearing down mangroves. And here's a not so fun fact for you, but if for every pound, every kilo, whatever you want to call it, of shrimp that you buy, there's about 26 times that worth of bycatch. So I would personally, I don't eat the stuff. You can make your own choices. You're all adults. I'm not your dad, but that's my thoughts on the subject. So, and then deep sea trawling, what is that? That's basically just dropping all sorts of destructive gear into the ocean and just like scraping entire ecosystems. And it's pretty terrible practice. Ocean acidification, we touched on earlier, which is just essentially making the oceans hostile to any organism that grows a skeleton, which is pretty much all of them, really. The oceans are now 30% more acidic than they were 100 years ago, so that's not great. And plastics and pollution, fun stuff here. We've all kind of heard this one. Plastic straw banning is a big thing, which I love, amazing. But up to 12.7 million tons of plastics are entering our ocean every year. And house this through over 5 trillion pieces of plastic in our ocean, enough to circle the world 400 times over. And we mentioned in our fun trivia, Terry, by the way, that was awesome trivia. I actually didn't know the answers to most of those. But even crustaceans in the Mariana Trench have been found to have ingested plastic. Not so cool. So what's the significance of this sort of stuff? Why am I even mentioning this? Just to paint that picture once again. But you can see over here, so most of the last 5 mass extinctions that occurred on this planet were directly attributable to the collapse of the oceans. So in that sense, ocean conservation is human conservation. So it's pretty important. We like our oceans over here, guys. But if you look over here at this funky little graphic, we can start to see, okay, some similar themes starting to occur here. So, okay, what do we got? Big one is Permian. So increase in methane and CO2, tick. Rapid global warming, tick. Oxygen removed from the oceans, tick. Desertification of land, tick. Okay, we're starting to see a theme here. Okay, cool. We're going to move on because we don't want to harp on that stuff. So let's chill out a bit. Let's not go this far. Let's not be waving around our little signs saying the end is near. Let's chill out a bit. So nature is incredibly resilient, as we all know. And I just want to sort of focus in on that a little bit now. A couple of key examples is, as we all know, with this first wave of COVID, look at the incredible resurgence we had of wildlife, the science that was coming out. We could start to see like massive clearing of our atmospheres as air travel, for example, slowed down and even stopped. In an incredibly short period of time, amazing things started to happen. Here's one of my absolute favorites. The Aldabra rail. If you haven't heard of the Aldabra rail, it is a species of bird that exists around Madagascar, and it went extinct about 20,000 years ago and then re-evolved itself back into existence like an absolute badass. It's just astonishing. So you can start to see nature is pretty amazing and will bounce back given the opportunity. And here's another one of my personal favorite fun facts, which is that the Great Barrier Reef itself owes its very existence to rising sea levels as a result of climate change. So about 12,000 years ago, we had our last ice age, and with that melting of the ice caps, all that water just whooshed over Australia, and all of a sudden we had this beautiful layer of earth beneath just a short shallow depth of water, providing ideal conditions for coral to grow, which created the largest living structure on the planet and just one of the most vital and vibrant ecosystems on the whole planet. So we start to see nature is pretty awesome. It will bounce back. So let's not be too bogged down and worried about all these challenges, because one of my absolute favorite things that I've learned from permaculture is there are no problems, there's only opportunities. And so I start to like to sort of frame what we're talking about here. And so this is one of my favorite things, is talking about we are the ocean. We are not separate from the ocean. We are the ocean. Just going back to that Rumi quote from earlier, we are the entire ocean in a drop. What do I mean by that? So we are obviously comprised of about 70% water. Our brains are 80% water. And so in that way, when we think about the cycle and the journey that water has been on, the ocean is the great distributor of resources. And when we think about every drop in some microscopic level has been around the world on its own journey 1,000,000 times over, and it has existed, the very same water that's in our bodies right now, I like to think of it as having been the very same water to sustain the life of our ancestors, essentially. And there's a beautiful image conjured by Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist, if anyone's familiar with his work. And he has this amazing thing he talks about where you stop and you close your eyes and you imagine yourself holding the hand of your mother, and she's holding the hand of her mother. And as we go back through time, and all of these mothers holding hands start to spread around the surface of the planet, all of a sudden it starts to not so much resemble a human hand anymore, but maybe the hand of a chimpanzee. All of a sudden it starts to resemble, oh, what does this look like over here? A bit more of a fish. You know, if in the case of a manatee, maybe they'll look a bit more like an elephant, or vice versa. What's going on there? But a beautiful thought exercise, I think. And even as far back as the Cambrian Explosion 500 million years ago, as our hands have evolved and taken on all these different forms, we can still look back and see that the sharks are still recognizably the same, which is, I think, a really beautiful thing. But it just goes to show you that, you know, the water, again, that exists within us right now has been this sustenance for everything else that's come before us, which I think is just amazing to think about. And I like to say this to people to shock them a little bit with kind of what I'm saying here, is that the water that's in you right now is probably peed out by a dinosaur at some point. It's been filtered by the ocean. That's what it does. But it's just a beautiful concept, I think. So we are the ocean. And Lauren Isley, this anthropologist, has a beautiful quote on it, saying that human beings are a way that water has of going about beyond the reach of rivers, which I think is beautiful. And so I've got this little point here talking about the journey of every drop, which you kind of just touched on there. 7-year-old me did not get this concept. I remember I was walking home from school with my dad one day, and we're getting just belted with rain. I'm like, this sucks, doesn't it? And my dad turned and he said to me, well, Mike, don't you think it's amazing that this water has been on this incredible journey just to land on you right now? I was like, no, that's dumb. It's in the sky, it fell. That's it. But now I get it. You know, it's beautiful. And so why have I got this wild, wacky image over here? This is from a movie. It's a terribly great movie. If you're a fan of like the Sharknado series, for example, it's kind of one of those. It's called Ghost Shark. And in Ghost Shark, the ghost shark can strike from any body of water. So if you're having a bath, ghost shark. If you're having a drink of water, ghost shark. Right? It's one of those. But then like the crux of it is that they go out to the desert where they think they're safe. Guess again, because we're 70% water, go shark. Yes. I just love it. So you get the idea. We are the ocean. So when we start to think about it that way, I think we all can maybe walk away with a brand new appreciation of what's going on out there in the ocean. So permaculture. Again, we can start to think about all of this in a new light. Start to reframe some of the ways we look at the ocean and the challenges that we're facing. And a big one that I kind of want to point out here is this concept of fair share. And for those who aren't aware, there's a big thing happening in the ocean right now with the overexploitation of tuna. And if anyone wants to do that funky raising their hand thing again, how much do you think one full tuna, bluefin tuna, sells for right now? on the market. Just one tuna. Terry? No?
$200.
$200. Oh, keep going.
Oh.
It is over $3 million. One full tuna, one full bluefin tuna sold for over $3 million to some sushi king. And so it's basically the most exploited fish in the ocean, basically, and this incredibly valuable commodity. But what's really happening there is absolutely devastating, because they've wiped them out to such a degree. It's dreadful. But the real tragedy there is that these companies that are farming tunas have enough tuna in cold frozen storage to last the entire population of Earth the next 15 years. And so they know for a fact that they need to step back and let these populations regenerate. But they won't do that, because that will mean that their prices will go down, which is, oh man, it's intense. And I was going to delve a little bit more into what's going on with the permaculture principles. So, but we need to wrap this up, I think. So we'll touch on, okay, marine permaculture. Pretty cool stuff. So kelp forests are absolutely foundational to marine ecosystems. Cool AF, you might say. And you can look up the Climate Foundation. Dr. Brian von Herzen is doing amazing things. And so with all sorts of technology now, they're transforming this desert landscape, this ocean desert, into thriving ecosystems as they introduce and repopulate these kelp forests. And kelp forests are amazing because they're actually more productive by a lot of counts than tropical rainforests. When we talk about carbon sequestration, these things can grow by 0.5 meter a day, which is astonishing. So when you start to proliferate these kelp forests, all of a sudden we can regenerate the primary production. If we can regenerate primary production, all of a sudden we're talking about sustainable fisheries become a viable concept. And upwelling as well. What is upwelling? They're coming up with these concepts where 93%, by the way, of heat is trapped by the ocean on the top surface layers of the ocean. And through upwelling, they will, hang on one second. Through upwelling, they will essentially pump the cool water from down past the, what do they call that? The thermocline, which is where it suddenly gets cooler. Pump that cool water up, and all of a sudden these reef systems will revitalize, which is amazing when we think about what's going on with reef systems worldwide right now and the wider implications. So check that out, Dr. Brian van Herzen at the Climate Foundation. Seaweed superpowers, again, super productive, super amazing. Azolla, if you haven't heard of it, is this amazing little seaweed that you can sprinkle on your salads, or you can feed it to your chickens. And because seaweed, again, the ocean being the great distributor of resources that it is, contains every known element on Earth. So if you put some seaweed out there in your compost, it's going to just absolutely explode the micro-organic compounds existing within your soil. It's going to do all sorts of fun stuff. So I'm going to have to wrap this up, I think, because of time. But oh man, I wish I could just nerd out about this with you guys for another hour or so, but check it out, the 2040 documentary. So what about me? Again, permaculture principles. Okay, sweet. So we're really zooming through this now, guys, but observe and interact. And I really wanted to talk to you guys, and especially Terry, I've been hearing about how you've been doing some free diving, talking about the impact that's had on you. This is a beautiful photo that came from that same Bahamas trip, by the way. Observe and interact. It will absolutely change your life. And I think everyone who's ever experienced that will attest to that very fact. I know I certainly will. My Octopus Teacher is a beautiful Netflix documentary that exists right now. Go check it out. Tells that story very well. And the roles of aquariums. So I fell in love with sharks at aquariums. So, you know, like there's some pros and cons to that whole situation, but the beauty there of being able to communicate this stuff is amazing. So permaculture principle number 1, observe and interact. This is that picture that I drew following that very same aquarium trip. So 6-year-old Mike didn't know how to spell, but he loved sharks. So again, no problems, only opportunities. And so this is a beautiful quote here we have from Jane Goodall, an amazing conservationist who I'm sure we all know. She says, I like to envision the whole world as a jigsaw puzzle. If you look at the whole picture, it is overwhelming and terrifying. But if you work on your little part of the jigsaw and know that people all over the world are working on their little bits, that's what will give you hope. And so I think that what I take from that is the permaculture principle number 10, which is diversity. which is that we all can do our weird and wonderful wild things to make such a valuable difference out there. And so, you know what, I'm not even going to tell this story. The short version of this is I was doing my wingsuit training, just loving life, flying it, jumping out of planes. My conservation hero, Rob Stewart, died, went on a mad cycling tour, ended up being involved with the shark finning, banning the shark finning process in Florida, which has since happened. You guys have banned the shark fin trade, which is an amazing thing you can all be wonderfully, wildly proud of. It was considered impossible and it has become possible. And Florida was considered a key holdout state. So with this victory, we can anticipate the momentum will continue, which is amazing. And this is another fun example of solutions turning something so terrible into something amazing. Cigarette Surfboard is a company that now exists. They take 10 to 15,000 cigarette butts and turn them into surfboards, which is absolutely awesome. You see here some fun facts about how much damage cigarettes are causing. But we're moving right on. This guy made a whole bunch. He made a whole floating, sustainable off-grid home out of plastic bottles. Pretty awesome stuff. And in conclusion, we are the ocean. Happy days. Gives us everything from the air we breathe to scuba diving. Turn this volcanic ball of space dust into a beautiful place to live. So what I would really want to impart on you guys is that it's the little things that make the biggest difference, from phytoplankton to you and I doing our little bits every single day. And the final analogy I kind of want to give there, guys, is with sharks. Sharks have an amazing ability called lateral line sense, which is the ability to detect pressure fluctuations through the water, which we absolutely cannot, we just can't do. So what I want to impart there, guys, is that you may not be able to see or feel the ripple effect of what's happening with your daily actions, but trust that it is happening. It's just every little wonderful thing that you guys do. So keep at it, keep crushing it. Challenge for you guys, just get out into the ocean, observe and interact, pick something about the ocean you love and learn everything you can about it, and just share away, dream up your own crazy ways to make a difference, and boom. There's some cool, fun resources for you guys to check out. But so I apologize, we've kind of gone over time. I tried to smash through that last half as much as I could there. But that's kind of what I got for you guys. So boom, there we go.
Definitely no apology needed, Michael. That was absolutely information packed. I can't believe you squeezed that much into that amount of time.
It was, yeah,
Thank
it was
you.
intense.
Can you tell us where to get in touch with you if we have any questions, or what's the best way to reach you?
Absolutely. Look, you can get in contact with me through just about any kind of channel ever. You can message me directly. Probably Instagram is the best one to connect with me. My Instagram handle is @skybeard, one word, skybeard. I used to have a beard. I had 5 years worth of beard. I just got rid of it recently. It's the whole thing. But you can reach me there. And I absolutely would love.
Wonderful. @skybeard. Yeah. And yeah, we've had a lot of questions and a lot of requests already for you to come back. So I'd love to. Awesome. I don't know what I was thinking of trying to put the oceans into one class. That's too big of a topic.
It's a very big topic, yeah.
We'll continue this conversation over on our Facebook community page. Amy can put that link on the chat, and there we're going to post all our questions there so it's easier to answer each of them. And I want to thank Amy for getting the production going, making this call happen. Thank you very much. If you got anything out of it, feel free to donate. We have a donate link that will be in the links below. And this video will be uploaded on YouTube, so you can check it out anytime. Next week, we're going to have David Algren talking about permaculture design, which is going to be really exciting. You don't want to miss that one. There's so much fertility found in the edges of an ecosystem. It can be hard to imagine the value in a world that we never get to touch or we never get to experience. And the deep oceans are responsible for so much of the food we eat and the air we breathe. And it's when we understand how important the smallest microorganisms are in our environment that we see the irreplaceable value of something as magnificent as our waters. We all share these oceans. I hope that we can all make choices that will protect them all for many generations to come. Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.